Hello and welcome to the December Crane Research Forum. Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Dr. Rebecca Dorr, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. These monthly forums feature research on emerging or key topics that impact the field of early childcare and education. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. My colleague Janelle is going to be running our chat box today, and we'll be adding helpful information and reminders there. And then as a heads up, at the end of today's forum, we will be asking you to fill out a super short survey. It'll only take a minute or two, but it's incredibly valuable to us. We're actually aiming for 100% participation because your feedback helps us shape future events, and we really want to make sure that they're meaningful to you. So I'll actually wrap up today a few minutes early before we hit that hour mark to allow you time to complete that survey before you move on to your other obligations for the day. We will have a link and a QR code on the screen and a link in the chat as well. So today I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Daniela Avelar. Dr. Avelar is a postdoctoral researcher here at the Crane Center at Ohio State. Dr. Avelar has a background in psychology, education, and learning sciences, and extensive research experience related to early childhood home learning environments. Specific areas of interest include shared reading interactions and early language and literacy development. She has published her work in top journals in the field on topics such as physiological arousal and emotion during ebook reading, shared reading in bilingual families, and language development among children and families experiencing poverty. She's currently part of the Small Talk research team, which focuses on identifying early risk factors for language development impairment among children from low-income households. Today, Dr. Avelar will discuss her recent research on late talkers, or children who have substantially lower vocabulary levels than their peers. She will share her findings related to the home characteristics that make some children more vulnerable or protected from being identified as late talkers, and will shed light on the importance of reporting and agreeing on parameters used to define late talkers for being able to support these children and their families. I'm really looking forward to this presentation and discussion, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. App.
Hi, thank you, Rebecca, for the introduction, and I'm excited to share with everyone some of our findings about late talkers and about late talkers identification, risks, and protective factors, and vocabulary growth in a Low-SES sample. So before we begin talking about our research findings, I'll give you a background about who late talkers are. So late talkers are children who show delayed productive vocabulary in the absence of other cognitive or developmental delays at 2 years old. Late talkers are identified by a score below the 10th percentile on the MacArthur-Bates Cognitive Development Inventories, or scoring below the 50th percentile on the Language Development Survey, being able to say less than 50 words, and or not being able to combine words. Again, this is when they are around 2 years old. Notably, being a late talker is not a diagnosis, but rather a risk factor for later language difficulties. And it is estimated that about 10 to 20% of toddlers are late talkers. So why is studying late talkers so important? Well, late talkers have a heightened susceptibility for being diagnosed with developmental language disorders. And having this diagnosis is associated with reading difficulties, attention difficulties, lower academic and vocational success, more emotional and behavioral problems, and problematic relationship with peers. And although studies estimate that about 50 to 75% of late talkers later perform within normal language limits, about 20 to 50% of late talkers are at risk for low language and later diagnosed with DLD. So this is why it is important to identify them early. That being said, many of these late talkers catch up with their peers and are called late bloomers. Now there is some division in the field about what to do with these late bloomers. Some suggest a wait and see approach when kids are behind. So we should just see if they catch up or not, and then if they don't catch up, then we will intervene. However, others think that this approach is problematic and early intervention should be what you do. Because even if the late talkers do catch up with their peers, the late talkers process language differently than their typically developing peers and may continue to show language learning difficulties throughout middle childhood and adolescence. So even if they catch up, they process language differently and later in life in language and literacy. So here are some examples of some studies that show these patterns. So children with a history of late talkers, so they were late talkers when they were toddlers. Then they caught up to their peers and they appeared normal, had normal language development, had lower scores in oral narrative skills, syntax, and story grammar at ages 8 and 9 years compared to their peers with no history of late talkers. In another study, compared to children with no history of being late talkers, late talker children obtain below normative scores in general language abilities, speech, syntax, and morphosyntax at 7 years old. And in another study, late talkers scored in the average range in language and reading assessment at 13 years and 17 years. However, they had weaker vocabulary, grammar, and verbal memory scores than their non-late talker peers at both ages. So today what I'm talking about are 3 papers from our small talk study. And small talk is a longitudinal study that focused on examining whether and to what extent family stress variables and protective factors affect children's language trajectories and DLD status of families experiencing low income. So in small talk, we collected data during 7 time points from when children were between 6 months and 60 months of age approximately. During this time period and during these data points, moms completed questionnaires and children completed language assessments. And the 3 papers I will talk about related to late talkers are about the parameters of late talker identification. So how do we identify late talkers? Risk and protective factors of late talking. So what makes you more or less likely to be a late talker? And vocabulary growth trajectories in late talkers. So what was unique about this sample and our studies related to late talkers was that our sample was entirely composed of low-SES families. And this was important because in the literature, there's an underrepresentation of low-SES families in other studies. So even in longitudinal studies and large samples that do include low-SES families, they include a few of them. They don't include exclusively a low-SES family. So we don't really know what's happening with these families in relation to late talkers. So there may be a higher prevalence of late talkers because of family stress, language quantity and quality, economic hardship, or other direct and indirect effects of poverty that are affecting these families in a different way than middle or upper SES families, and we're not aware of these and how to help them. And this is important to investigate and has implication for research, practice, and policies. There's also protective factors or resiliency in these families that we should investigate as well. So this, with the small talk sample, we are able to investigate what is happening in this sample specifically in relation to late talkers, protective factors, and risk factors. So the first paper I will talk about are the parameters for LT identification, and this comes from our paper that was published in the spring called The Impact of Diverse Parameters for Late Talker Identification in a Low-SES Status Sample. So this So defining late talkers and the parameters used to identify late talkers are important to ensure consistency among researchers and practitioners on who is considered a late talker. So different researchers have, throughout the literature, have used different assessments, definitions, and parameters to define and assess who can be a late talker. And this can lead to discrepancies between studies and possible misidentification of late talkers. This is what we found when we're doing our literature searches and what's been found in meta-analysis. So this can also create problems because some kids can be identified as late talkers using certain parameters, but not others. So there may be some children that are misidentified as late talkers and receiving services that they are not needing using certain parameters, or the opposite can be true. So they can be misidentified as not being late talkers and they're not receiving the services that they may need to support them and their families. So really being careful about what parameters we use, what definitions of which assessments has really practical implications both for research and for practice and policy. So to our knowledge, this is the first study to explore and quantify how using different parameters to identify LTs yield different differences in the identification of late talkers. So here are different measures that can be used for late talker identification. The Language Development Survey, the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventories, Ages and Stages questionnaires. We use the CDI, which is the Communicative Development Inventories. Specifically, we wanted to test the third edition in comparison to the second edition, which came out recently in 2023. And this was used a larger and more diverse sample, which more accurately represents the socioeconomic status differences in children's language development, which was particularly relevant for our sample. And our research questions were, how does the number of identified late talkers differ when using different parameters in a low socioeconomic status sample? We tested different parameters. We looked at the difference between age, when kids were 18 to 23 months compared to 24 to 30 months. As I just mentioned, the second edition standards versus the third edition standards. So the second edition was the one that was used in most papers prior to 2023. So we wanted to see how late talker status would change now that the third edition is out. Using the conservative 10th percentile cutoff values that is most commonly used compared to a little more lenient 15th percentile. The unisex norms of the CDI versus the norms by sex, since we know that males are most likely to be identified as late talkers than females. And using the number of words produced versus combining words, since those are criteria for late talker identification. And then finally, how stable is the identification of LTs by age. So for this, we used the surveys completed by moms, the CDIs when they were at the two different age ranges that we were interested in, from 18 to 23 months and the 24 to 30 months. And there were 238 mother-child dyads that completed this surveys at this time points. And to the analysis we used were chi-squares. So here is a table that shows all the different percentages by all the different parameters we use. We'll go through them in the next few slides by research question, but this just shows how much variability there is based on the different parameters, and goes to highlight why it is so important for researchers to really report which parameters they're using. And As you can see, there is a wide range going from 28-29% all the way to 43%. And this is higher than the previously reported in the other studies that range from 10 to 20%. So here we will go through the first research question, that is age, from the 18 to 23-month-olds in blue. We see the older age in yellow. They are slightly higher or the same in the older range, so 35 and 36, 34 and 35. But we will go through the stability later on for research question 2. So for second edition versus third edition, so second edition is in blue and third edition is in green. There were more late talkers identified with the second edition. So in line with the third edition being more representative, this makes sense because the third edition is capturing more of the variability and representation for the Low-SES sample. So it's more accurate and representative. So we can see, for example, for the older age range, 36 compared to 32, 35, and 29, and so on. And these chi-squares were statistically significant as well. For the 10th percentile versus 15th percentile, more late talkers were identified with the 15th percentile cutoff. Again, this makes sense because if we're using 15 percentile as the cutoff, more kids are going to be identified, but we can see specifically how much more. So here, for example, 32 versus 40, 29 versus 36, and these chi-squares were significant as well. So for the unisex versus norms versus sex comparisons, here are the actual percentages if you want to take a look. But the main takeaway from this is that using the unisex by norms, 40% of males and 23% of females were identified as late talkers. If we're using norms by sex, 31% of males and 27% of females are identified as late talkers. Here, there is a significant difference. Here, there is not. So, using the norms by sex can reduce substantially or even eliminate sex differences in late talker identification at this age. So, this is something to consider once you are deciding which norms you want to use for your study. And interestingly enough, as we were reading most of our the papers we're using for our literature reviews and trying to inform all of our papers, this is the parameter that is least that we saw least reported in the other papers. So people tend to report the cutoff point that they use and which assessment they use, but not if they're using CDI, they don't report which norms they use. And as you see, there is a big difference in the number of late talkers that are identified based on which norms they use. So this is important to report, and because it makes a difference on how many kids get identified. And finally, words produced versus combining words. This chi-square was significant, and using only combining words as a criterion for classification, 45% of kids get identified. And this is specifically for third edition. This one, norms by sex for the older kids. and 45% of kids get identified as late talkers, whereas 29% get identified if we're using words produced. 26% of children are identified if we use both criteria simultaneously. So combining words as the lone criteria to identify LTs could lead to misclassification of a high percentage of children. So just combining words does not seem advisable because a lot of kids can be misclassified. Using both seems like the most conservative approach, but using words produced seems like pretty close to using both. And for stability and age of identification, 86% of children didn't change from time point 3 to time point 4. 7% improved from time point 3 to time point 4. 8 fell back from time point 3 to time point 4. This relationship was significant. It seems using the third edition by sex seems more stable than the unisex one. 10th percentile was more stable than the 15th percentile, and third edition was more stable than the second edition. So that meaning like there was less change there, and they were a lot more stable. Using words produced was a lot more stable than using combining words. And we see that there is change from time point 3 to time point 4, suggesting that it should be better just to stick with time point 4 because there is change happening from 3 to 4. So just to recap what we found from time point 3, from study 1, there is a higher incidence of late talkers than in previous study. We saw it range from 28% to 43% compared to 10 to 20% in previous studies. It is critical for researchers to report what standards and parameters they use for late talker identification. It increases transparency, replicability, and comparison across studies. The parameters impact prevalence of late talkers. Determining and agreeing upon the most robust parameters is critical. The third edition norms by sex and 10 percentile cutoff seems to be the most conservative and reasonable approach in our sample specifically, but more research is needed to determine long-term implication for under and over identification with different parameters. And identifying late talkers early and accurately is critical for early language intervention. Because children could be missing out on receiving treatment and support, which is particularly concerning in Low-SES samples. Some limitations is that this was parent-reported data, and these parameters need to be evaluated with larger and more diverse populations for this to be generalizable. And children may be at risk and need more intervention, but knowing how different parameters affect late talkers in the general population is important for practice and policy to maximize potential benefits. Our next paper is the risk and protective factors of LT, and this is from our late talking in low income sample child care as a protective factor paper, which is currently under review. So findings from large population-based studies have found that there are risk and protective factors for who is more likely to be a late talker. Some risk factors that have been found to be significant in previous studies are that being from a large household size, low maternal education, family history of late talker, late birth order, preterm birth, low birth weight, bilingual home, ethnic minority, and male sex are risk factors, so it make you more likely to be a late talker. But there are protective factors such as daily book reading, having informal play sessions with your caregiver, or attending childcare make you less likely to be a late talker. So in our current study, we found, like, what motivated our study was that we found that only one study had specifically investigated late talkers in a low SES sample. So we wanted to further explore how household context variables related to late talkers in our sample specifically. So we identified risk and protective factors for late talkers, so future researchers and clinicians can identify new pathways for interventions for low SES children at heightened risk for late talking status. Our question was, to what extent are household context variables associated with late talker status in a low SES sample when children are around 2 years old? We had data for 199 mother-child diets from our small talk study. Moms completed family background questionnaires and the CDI words and sentences when children were between 24 and 30 months. We used the CDI words produced to calculate late talker identification using our third edition 10th percentile norm by sex parameters. And we did a binomial logistic regression to determine whether and to what extent chosen household context variables help explain late talking in this sample. So here are our results for our binomial logistic regression. The model was statistically significant. Out of our 11 variables tested, which are listed in this column, the only significant variable was childcare attendance. And here we see that the odds ratio is 4.71, which is rather large. And what this means is that children not attending childcare had 4.71 times higher odds of being classified as late talkers than children attending childcare. So childcare seems to be a protective factor for late talking status. We also ran some chi-square analysis prior to doing this logistic regression, and most of these were not significant. A few of them were, and we explored some of the relationships between some of our variables. One that we were particularly interested in that I'm going to share with you is the relationship between mother employment and child care attendance, which we created a combined variable between mother employment and child care attendance. And here's what we saw, that the combination of both variables, child care attendance and mother employment, related to late talking was statistically significant. So children who attended childcare and whose moms were employed had the lowest incidence of late talking, followed by, so it was 13%, followed by children who attended childcare but whose mothers were not employed, so 21%. Just note that we only had 3 kids in this category, so we interpret that with caution. And then the incidence of late talker status was much higher for children not attending childcare and whose moms were employed or not employed, so 63% and 62%. So something interesting is happening here. It has potential implications for practice here as well in this relationship between childcare, mother's employment, and late talking status. That grants future investigation, and like I said, so implications for research and policy, probably increasing, and made us think about maybe increasing mothers' employment opportunities could increase opportunities to afford more childcare, because maybe making childcare more affordable and opening more centers, opening more spots may impact children's language, especially for low SES children at risk for being late talkers. Interestingly, we found similarities and differences between our findings and previous studies, possibly because our sample is only low SES. The childcare finding is similar to other studies, but our odds ratio was a lot higher than in previous studies. We didn't find any significance with all our other variables. compared to the other studies though. In learning more about risk and protective factors for LTs among low SES children is critical for designing and implementing appropriate interventions. Some limitations in future studies. Again, this was parent-reported data. We had some low response rate and additional variables of interest that we would have wanted to test. We only focused on childcare attendance, so whether the child attended childcare or not. But the quality of the childcare is also important and warrants further investigation, like the quantity and quality of language exposure at the childcare facility, for example, that the kid is exposed to. And having a larger and more diverse sample size would also allow for further generalization of our findings. Okay, and now our last study is vocabulary growth trajectory. And this is from our study examining early vocabulary growth trajectories in late talkers in low-income longitudinal sample, which was also published earlier this year. So the higher prevalence of late talkers in low-income populations in limited large longitudinal data sets documenting early language growth trajectories in this population in the US prompted us to investigate this study. And the current study analyzed longitudinal data collected entirely from families experiencing low income. And we wanted to get a clearer picture of vocabulary growth trajectories among low SES late talkers and non-late talker peers, in order to inform best clinical educational practices on whether and when to intervene. So our research questions were therefore, do late talkers show a delayed or different trajectory compared to non-late talker peers in a low SES sample? And at what age do vocabulary trajectories diverge? So again, we had 199 mother-child diets from our small talk study, but this time we were looking at their data from when they were 8 months old to 30 months old, since we were interested in their growth trajectory. We looked at their CDIs questionnaires, but this time the words and gestures and the words and sentences forms. And we used the words and sentences for their LT identification. Again, same parameters, 10th percentile cutoff, third edition, norms by sex. And for analysis, we did multi-level, multi-group models for growth trajectories, and we compared the models using different fit statistics to find the best model. We found that the free slope model provided the best fit among the 3 models tested. The Wallace test on slope differences confirmed our hypothesis. And what we found was that late talkers and non-late talker peers grew in vocabulary at significantly different rates from 8 to 30 months. Both groups showed vocabulary size estimate growth as age increased. So they were both increasing in vocabulary, so that was good. However, late talkers' vocabulary size increased at a much slower rate. And the non-late talkers showed an exponential growth. So what did this look like? Here's a scatter plot estimating the vocabulary counts by age and the fit lines by group. So in gray, we see the peers or the non-late talkers. So this is their estimated vocabulary count converted from their from their CDI scores. So we see, again, a lot of variability, but they start pretty much the same. And then the non-late talkers are increasing exponentially almost. The late talkers, however, pretty much stay very flat. There are some that are starting to increase here, but it's mostly a very flat trajectory here with a very slight increase. So we see a very different growth trajectory happening here. And then for our second research question, the age of divergence, the trajectories for the vocabulary size estimates diverge at 10 months. So this is where we're seeing different patterns starting, growth trajectories starting to emerge at around 10 months and reaching a moderate effect size at 11 months. And just to double check, we did a robustness check using the percentile ranks instead of the vocabulary estimates. And we found similar results, divergence at 10 months, moderate effect at 11 months. So just summing up, a different vocabulary growth for late talkers and non-late talkers. Late talkers have a relatively flat trajectory. They acquire vocabulary slower and have a smaller vocabulary size at 24 months. The non-late talkers have an exponential vocabulary growth. There's a vocabulary gap between late talkers and non-late talker peers, and it increases exponentially as children age. Again, these are findings from our Low-SES sample. It might look different in a different sample or in a sample that is not entirely from a Low-SES population. Also, notably, a point of divergence does not equal a point of late talker identification. So these results show that this is where the growth trajectory is starting to diverge. It is not suggesting that this is the age where we should identify late talkers and start to treat them. This is simply where we start seeing differences in their vocabulary patterns starting to emerge. This is also the first US longitudinal study in a fully Low-SES sample, and there are at a heightened risk for late talkers, so this is very significant and has practical implications. Some limitations and future directions. This is a more diverse sample needed to generalize findings. There was some missing data and attrition across time points, so that's important to keep in mind. As with our other studies, this was all mother-reported data, so some observer-rated tests of child vocabulary production could have been helpful as well. And late talker status was determined using the same measure for mapping the growth trajectory. So some clinical assessment of late talker status using another measure could be an alternative as well. Just to wrap up, I just want to thank the current Small Talk team and additional collaborators on the included papers, and our previous Small Talk team members who help with data collection and cleaning. Anyone has any questions?
Thank you so much. We do have some questions coming in the Q&A box, but please, audience, keep them coming there and get your questions in for Dr. Avelar. The first question that came in was about identification, and they said, while the chi-squares show differences in identification, you can't necessarily gauge the accuracy for them, right? So do you plan on running any discriminant analysis to be able to speak to implications for over or under identification with these different parameters in your future research?
We haven't. We mostly wanted to see what the different parameters showed, because that is something we saw in the literature that not a lot of people report what is out there, like what they use or which one is better. Our goal was not to say this is the golden standard. We simply wanted to lay out these are there is a difference based on like the parameters you use. And that's what we set out to do, and I think that's more like for clinicians to judge than for us, but for sure that it could be an avenue for research that we specifically didn't set out to do, but I
Sure.
think
Yeah. And
that
that,
as we started doing this, like that was one concern we saw. Like these are how many kids could be misclassified as under or over, but unless we have a different set of clinical analysis to be done, clinical evaluation that is not the CDI
mhm.
to go along with it, we can't tell with just the CDI. That I think that's the real reason. Unless we have a different test to go along with it, we can't determine it.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, you will have, you're looking at, the earlier time points, but this is a large longitudinal study that I know is still ongoing. And so you will have data from later time points at some
Yes.
point, right? To be able to say, like, will you be able to look at things like, okay, so, um, the children that were identified when it was 25%, how does that look in terms of over under identification compared to when it was 50%? Like who ends up getting identified for DLD
Yes.
later, who ends up
Yes. That
having,
that we will be able to tell like how
yeah,
like there how many of these kids get diagnosed or are more likely to get diagnosed with DLD. Yes.
right.
But how accurately, like for this time point, are they late talkers or not late talkers? I think that's different. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think just late talkers specifically, like we would love to like get a or like have gotten like a clinician, like another measure
Hmm.
as well for like the validity of this.
Yeah, absolutely. But it'll be really interesting to see what you all find when you're able to look at the different ways that you identified them and what those children end up looking like, at
Yeah,
four or five, since
yeah,
you'll have that data.
that's the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wondered about that specifically in relation to the gender differences you're looking at. So I don't know this literature very well, but you were saying that males are more likely to be identified as late talkers, but like should males be identified as late talkers more often? If that, like, are males more likely to be identified with DLD, diagnosed with DLD, and have lower language skills later on? Like, should we be seeing those gender differences in late talker identification, or is it a good thing to be able to sort of eliminate those because we don't see differences in later outcomes? Does that make sense?
Yep. That's a whole debate in the literature as we started
Okay.
seeing like some people want to keep those differences, some people don't, which is why I think it's so important to report which standards you use, like which norms you use. And
Absolutely.
then if you're not reporting them, then how can people replicate or how can people know what you did? So I don't I think regardless of which way you choose, just being transparent about what you did is helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question that came in about father involvement. They were wondering if you looked at father involvement in your research and if you plan to include father involvement in later studies or later time points for this sample.
Yeah, so for our small talk data, all of the participants were mothers. So unfortunately, we won't. But I think that is something really important to look at in general. But for small talk, we won't.
Yeah, I was wondering, relatedly, in you showed all those, like the previous literature that showed all the different factors that impact late talker identification, and some of them were more like home environment, family factors, especially those protective factors, right? And I was wondering about the fact that you didn't see that in this sample, and I wonder if you could speculate on why you thought you didn't see some of those impacts. I assume you have some data on things like um, home environment and play and things like that. And I wondered if you could speak to why you think that childcare was the thing that came out there and none of those other factors.
Yeah, we looked at, for example, home language,
Hmm.
and we didn't have that many kids who spoke another language.
Mm.
We had, I think, 13%, but I think it might be also the way the question was asked, or um, we could have asked like more questions, like how many hours you speak, or how much, like what percentage,
Hmm.
or like get more information about the home language maybe could have made a difference. Or we asked about ethnicity was another one. And maybe the way the question is asked or the way the parent responds. Or I think we only also had like, I don't know, like for like it was just Hispanic or not Hispanic. Maybe that's why. And it was like 8% of our sample. Whereas other study, the one study that did find an effect, it was, I think the sample was 50%. Like I don't know. So like it's differences in the like the type of sample you find. Or some of these studies were conducted in like Australia, and the other one was in the UK, and the other one was in Canada. And another study was conducted in 2003, and the other one in 1996, and the other one in 2003. So I think a lot of factors are affecting this, other than like our study was specifically in a low-SES sample, whereas these other studies were included like 15% was low-SES. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a lot happening. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, and childcare had such a huge effect that could have been affecting that too.
Absolutely. Yeah, we had another question come in about the childcare component and asking about whether you're able to look at differences in childcare done in a home or a center or the number of children that are in care together. Can you speak to any of that?
So this was like our first paper looking at this,
Mhm.
and we are hoping to in the future do only childcare paper, since we found this and we want to dig deeper, and do like childcare and language paper. And really, we don't have that much information about childcare, but we do have information about, I think, the type of childcare, the hours in childcare, and one other variable that I'm forgetting. So really try to see with the variables we have what is going on between childcare and language.
Yeah. And maybe that will allow you to shed a little bit more light on mechanism. And I know you spoke to this a little bit, but could you speculate a little bit more based on the literature and what you know from your sample about why you think childcare is protective in general and then was so protective with such strong large effect sizes in this sample?
I think they're getting more language exposure
Mhm.
just being in childcare. Different types of language, probably. Just being around other adults
Mhm.
and kids, but primarily getting language exposure from adults. We don't really know what's happening at
Mhm.
home. We don't know what's happening with like mom and dad, but just being in childcare, especially if it's high quality childcare,
Absolutely.
they're getting exposed to language and interactions. And this we know is important for child development and language specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I wondered about this person's question about the number of children in care together too, because I wonder if another possible mechanism is something about having to speak up and to get your needs needs met, right?
Right,
In a setting with more children where you're not as much the focus. But I know there's also birth order effects that may be
right.
contradictory to that mechanism. So it's interesting. There is a lot of different components there. I wondered, I know you also have expertise in bilingualism, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I know you don't have a lot of families in this sample that speak a different home language, but I wonder if you could just speak more broadly about the literature in this area as it relates to bilingualism and late talkers and language development more broadly.
Yeah. So this is something like reviewers brought up because we had in one paper like 13 and another like 18% of 15 bilinguals in our sample. Um, but yeah, in our sample we had families from a lot of different languages, so it kind of made it difficult to just assess with one
Hmm.
survey and just test all of them. But we did try to assess different languages as best as possible with equivalent surveys and translations. But we did test run all our analysis with and without the bilingual kids, and all our results were the same.
Mhm.
So at least we know like they weren't skewing our results one way or another. So they were behaving similar to the monolingual kids, at least in our
Okay.
sample. So we didn't see the expected different patterns that we thought we would see. There are other papers on late talkers and bilinguals that are seeing something different.
Mhm.
So we don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, interesting. And I know my understanding is that some literature on the bilingualism is that they sort of look like late talkers early on, but then they end up
yeah,
having like larger vocab. Is that accurate?
yeah. That tends to happen in a lot of. I don't know about late talker. The late talker bilingual literature is
Yeah.
different, but
Okay.
I know that bilinguals in general, like a lot of parents are concerned that kids are behind
Right.
because they don't know a lot of words, and parents tend to get worried. But what happens is that kids might know, like, let's say 10 words in English, but they know 40 words in Spanish.
Hmm.
And then the parents are like, ah, my kid is behind because they only know 10 words in English. But if you put them together, they actually know 50, so they're not
Right.
really behind.
Yeah, absolutely.
They
Okay.
catch up eventually.
Great. Great. Yeah, a couple other questions coming in the chat. One was about have you ever conducted research on using storytelling as an intervention for children with speech delay? So either you or your team or other research that you know about, if you could speak to that.
For late talkers specifically, no. But that is something we are thinking about, and doing interventions is something that I'm personally interested in. So I
And
think that's
story. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think that's something that could be good, and just storytelling in general is a great way to increase language and to create like language um, interactions between mom and child or parent and child, because it has a lot of benefits. You're increasing vocabulary, you're increasing structure. It's guided, but it creates a lot of opportunities to increase talk around the book as well.
Yeah.
So it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, and my understanding is a lot of that literature looks at slightly older children, maybe like preschool age range, and so
Yeah,
looking at it in this younger age range, maybe less common. I know there's some of it out
yeah.
there.
I mean that's what we're looking at.
Yeah.
Hopefully, starting soon one day.
Yes. Another question was about self-efficacy, and if you could speak to whether self-efficacy is also impacting children's ability to speak or late talker identification.
Interesting. I don't know, but I thought this was going for parents because that is one of the protective factors we have
Okay.
for
Hmm.
parents.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what that person was referring to. Maybe they can respond in the chat or in the question answer if they're referring to the child self-efficacy or parent self-efficacy, but you could, yeah, speak to either. Answer for both, maybe.
Yeah. I don't know, but that's an interesting point.
But for parents, did you find evidence of parental self-efficacy being
We're
effective or that?
using it as a moderator in our
Mhm.
models for parental self-efficacy as a moderator to see if it's a protective factor.
Okay, interesting. Another question came in about whether there's a different assessment moving forward in 2026. And I know some of this research is ongoing, and you mentioned the third edition, and if there are further editions of
I
what you're
don't think
using.
so. So for reference, the second edition of the CDI came out in 2006,
Hmm.
I believe. So I don't
It
see
takes a
them
while.
making a new one. But this one's working. I mean, it seems great.
Excellent. And then we alluded to the fact that some of this is still ongoing. Obviously, you still have more work to do with the data that you have. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your future plans, both with the data you already have, and I know some data is still being collected with this sample, just so people know what to keep an eye out for in the future.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, we're looking more into the childcare area, trying to figure out more about what happened there, and then looking at more relationships between late talkers and DLD and
Mhm.
language. So like what happens once,
Right.
like the relationship between like late talker and later language in general. So whether that is DLD or language at when kids are. So right now late talkers were 2 year olds. So when they're 3 or 4 or a little older,
Mhm.
that's what we're trying to see what this predicts for later.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have to have you back on in a few years to share additional findings. Well, thank you for this wonderful presentation and conversation. Thank you, Dr. Avelar.
Thanks for all your questions.
And as promised, I wanted to wrap up a few minutes early now for the audience members to fill out that short survey. Please do take a moment to fill that out. Janelle, I think we'll throw that up on the screen as well. There's a